So, in my opinion, best fiction book ever written is The Count of Monte Cristo. It's fantastic. I've read it 4 times. Each time it gets better. I'm not a guy who reads books twice. So I've read it 4 times. It's amazing. The main character, his name is Edmond Dantes. And whenever I hear that name, I instantly think of the adventures of the book. I'm transported into the story. It's his story. And I know many of you are readers. Think of the main characters in your favorite books. When you hear that name, you think of the story. Sherlock Holmes, Jack Ryan, Nancy Drew, Harry Potter, Scarlett O'Hara. You can probably retell the story in your mind. And it's interesting to me that many of the people healed by Jesus in the New Testament, they aren't given names. Jesus does a number of these miracles, but the gospel writers don't record their names. And my guess is individuals disappeared into the pages of history following their healing. No one tracks the people down later, and so we don't know their story beyond the facts of when their lives intersected with Jesus for moments. We only get a glimpse. Bartimaeus, though, he clearly is around for more than just a moment. He's the only person who is healed in Mark's gospel who is named. And I think I know the reason. Jesus heals him, and he tells him to go on his way, and we're told that Bartimaeus recovers his sight and follows Jesus. He must have joined up with the community and become one of the disciples. The story happens immediately before Jesus enters Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. So Bartimaeus joins the Christian community at the apex of tension and uncertainty. But he experienced such a miracle that he stuck around, and he must have become known to the early believers, because this remarkable story finds its way into Mark's gospel, and he gets a name, and known well enough that his father is identified as well. So this is clearly more than just we know of him. For a brief moment, the action swirls around Bartimaeus. And in that, we see the incredible grace of Jesus Christ. We see the transformative power of his love. We see lives changed in a way that invites us to consider our own standing and our own needs. And all of this in a story that nearly wasn't. Bartimaeus is sitting on the outskirts of town. Jesus is leaving Jericho, and Bartimaeus is crying out, and people are rebuking him. They're telling him to be silent. Jesus was on his way somewhere, and the crowds didn't think Bartimaeus was worth stopping for. They tried to silence him, but Jesus stopped. And in all of this, Jesus is teaching us. As I've said before, when we read the Gospels, the Gospel writer had to select certain scenes to include the life and teachings of Jesus, held countless more miracles than just the ones we have on record. But each Gospel writer picks the best stories that they think most faithfully illustrate who Jesus was. And so here Mark is showing us a Savior who stops when he hears the cries of someone in need. And despite the world telling Jesus to move on, Jesus stops and attends to that person. Right? So each of us, at some point in our lives, we need to be reminded that Jesus hears us when we cry out. If you remember early in the book of Exodus, we're told the Israelites are groaning because of the trials of their slavery. And in the midst of their groaning, it says God hears. It's so important for us to hold on to know that our cries and our pain, that God hears that. And it's interesting, in the reading from Mark, others are telling Bartimaeus to be quiet, and maybe you've experienced the same thing. The world is telling you to stop crying out. You've ever been told you need to get over something, that you need to move on, even when you are not ready to. Mark has a message for you. Jesus has a message for you. Your cries are valid. No matter how dismissive the world may seem to be, Jesus cares. And thus, Jesus is teaching us the church ought to care for you. God knows. Even when the world is telling you to be quiet, God hears your cry. It's also a warning, right? Again, Jesus is teaching us. And he's warning us to be very careful about what we ignore, because we are traveling down a road. We are headed somewhere. And it's so easy for us to get focused on that. And we miss the people we're passing by along the way. We are too busy, too burdened to stop and to care. God is important to their cries, and if they're important to God, they should be important to us. Genesis tells us each one of us made in the image of God. I've said it over and over again. The psalmists, each of us are fearfully and wonderfully made, knit together in our mother's wombs. And so if we as the church are to err, May we err on the side of listening to those who cry out, because they're clearly important to God, and therefore they should be important to us. And so Bartimaeus is called by Jesus, and he throws off his cloak. And it symbolizes he's throwing off his past. His cloak would have been vitally important. It's what kept him warm. Maybe he used it as a blanket, as a pillow. Remember, he's living by the side of the road. He does not have many possessions. The cloak may have been his most prized possession, but he throws it off. He springs up toward Jesus. He hasn't even been healed yet, and he is leaving his old life behind. Such is his faith and trust in Jesus. He is ready to be changed. And Jesus looks at him and asks him a question. What do you want me to do for you? It seems so obvious. And yet Jesus doesn't assume. This is the Jesus we're told in Revelation who stands at the door and knocks. This is the Jesus who wants to come in but does not break down the door. I think about the end of the story of the road to Emmaus. When Jesus makes like he's going to go on and the disciples have to insist that he comes in, and then they break bread together and they realize who Jesus was. But they had to invite him in. He comes near, and yet he wants to be invited in. And then he asks, what do you need? What do you want? What would you say to Jesus in that moment? There's all sorts of things that we want. But if you had one moment with him, what would you ask for? What do you really want God to do for you? And it's a helpful exercise. Because we think our first instinct, maybe something is not truly what we need, what we really want. And it's helpful for us to reflect and to think about that. I would really love $1 billion. I think it would be really nice. But is that what I truly need? How can I be an influence for Christ in my community? How do I raise my children well? What wisdom do I need, especially in this crazy world, to be a place of peace? To be an advocate for the church? What do I need to serve the community? To proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ in word and deed? What do I need for that? What do I really want? None of us answer that question the same way, and yet each of us ought to wrestle with the question, because the Lord hears our cry, comes to us with gentleness, with love, and with strength, and with power. When we learn to trust him, he equips us and sends us just as he sends Bartimaeus. He tells Bartimaeus to go on his way, but as we talked at the beginning, the way of Bartimaeus is changed. Jesus changes us. He changes our direction. Bartimaeus is now a Jesus follower. This blind roadside beggar, he discovers a community of believers and he joins. Because he chooses the way of Christ, his name is written in the book of life. This becomes his story. He is marked as Christ's own forever. And it's so wild to me that it happens as Jesus is leaving Jericho, on his way to Jerusalem to be crucified. Palm Sunday, Jesus is about to have this triumphal entry into the city, and Bartimaeus is surely going to be amazed by all of this, and he's blind, so he doesn't see anything. And what's one of the first things he's going to see is people waving palm branches, laying their coats down on the road, and it's this triumphant, and it's going to be transformed into tragedy within the week. And yet Bartimaeus clearly remains with the community, because he's known well enough that his name is recorded. This is his story too. Our story is joined with Christ's story. That's what happens when Jesus dies for us and rises for us. That we are so transformed that the story, his grace, his perfection is transferred to us. And so that's the righteousness that is now ours, that we can claim as believers in Jesus Christ. And so his story becomes our story, our names. Just like Bartimaeus, our names are written in the book of life. And what a joy that is, and how that transforms us. And so Jesus is saying, look at what happens. You're transformed. You become a part of this family, this community of believers. But Jesus is also teaching us. He's also saying, okay, so now that changes your way. It changes the direction that you go. It changes the way you interact. And so pay attention to the way I treat the blind beggars on the side of the road. The world is telling them to be quiet. The world is telling them that we're all too busy for them. But Jesus says, how will you respond? How will you give grace the same way that Jesus gives grace to you? How will you invite others to join their story with the story of the Church of Jesus Christ, to be transformed, to be changed, to have their ways changed? And so may we, as a people who have been saved by the grace, whose names are now written, and this becomes our story, may we live in such a way that our hearts and the eyes of our hearts are changed so that we see differently, and that we invite others to join in this story. The story of grace and the story of love, the story of salvation that is made possible only through the grace and the power and the tenderness and the strength of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God.